Previously in Thomas and Mac's story. After leaving the chaos behind, Thomas drifted north until the road ended in Wayne National Forest, Ohio, and there, he met Mac, a weathered old rail rider who'd survived worse than the apocalypse. The two struck up an unlikely friendship and made their home in a line of abandoned train cars. One of those cars had derailed long ago, trapping a half-crushed walker that Mac occasionally chatted with for company. Without warning, Mac uncoupled the wreck and led Thomas to the cab. He admitted he had no idea what he was doing, then hit a giant red button. Against all odds, the engine roared to life. With no map, no real destination, and nothing left to lose, they rolled into the unknown on steel rails. A pair of survivors heading somewhere, anywhere, away from the ghosts of the past. The low groan of the engine rolled through the cab as the wheels bit into the rusted rails. The first few feet felt uncertain, the whole frame shuddering as if the old locomotive might quit before it truly began. But then momentum took over. Steel clanged and joints rattled as the train pushed forward into the trees. Mac sat in the engineer's chair, one hand steady on the throttle, the other gripping a can of Coors Banquet. His expression wasn't loud or boastful, just the quiet satisfaction of a man who had done something he wasn't entirely sure he could. Wayne National Forest stretched out on either side, a tunnel of brown trunks and bare branches swallowing the track ahead. Dead leaves swirled in the wake of the train, scattering back into the undergrowth. Somewhere in the distance, the flash of a startled deer cut through the shadows. Inside the cab, the air smelled of diesel, rust, and long-settled dust. Loose panels trembled against the vibrations, a rhythmic metallic chatter mixing with the steady clink of a dangling chain somewhere behind them. Mac didn't take his eyes from the track as the forest pulled them deeper into its heart. "There's no turning back now," he said. The rails disappeared into the gloom ahead, a silver path that promised nothing except forward motion. The steel rails hummed beneath them, the forest rolling by in slow, steady frames. Thomas leaned back in his seat, glancing over at Mac with a crooked half-smile. "Guess we're both train-riding hobos now, Mac." Mac didn't look away from the track, but one corner of his mouth twitched in amusement. "Speak for yourself, kid. I'm classy. My Coors isn't even warm yet." They rode in silence for a while, the sound of the engine and the rhythmic clatter of the wheels filling the cab. Mile after mile of Wayne National Forest slid past. Dense tangles of branches, half-frozen puddles, the occasional rustle of something slipping away deeper into the trees. It wasn't until the third-mile marker slid past that Thomas felt the nagging thought creeping in. He glanced over his shoulder, scanning the short length of cars behind them. Then it hit him. "Oh shit." Mac finally glanced over. "What?" "Our bathroom bucket. It's still on the other car." There was a long pause. The train rattled over a seam in the track, jolting them both. Mac took a slow sip of his beer. "Guess we're really hobos now." Thomas groaned, sinking into his seat. "We had one bucket, Mac. One." Mac just chuckled under his breath and pushed the throttle a hair forward, the forest swallowing them deeper into its cold embrace. The train rumbled steadily through the dense, late summer green of Wayne National Forest, the rhythmic clatter of steel wheels on steel rails making it almost hypnotic to watch the trees roll past. Thomas leaned against the side of the open doorway, the wind in his face carrying the smell of pine and warm metal. A few hours ahead, the rails curved, and Thomas noticed something strange. The ties and ballast here looked off. It wasn't the old, weathered track they'd been riding. The stretch looked newer, straighter, the kind of line that didn't belong to any railroad he'd heard of. He exchanged a glance with Mac, who had been sitting cross-legged near the doorway, hands resting on his knees, staring out like he was reading the land. Mac broke the silence first. "You know," he said, voice carrying over the wind, "before all this, before I was riding trains and eating beans out of a can, I was a helicopter mechanic in the Army. Black Hawks mostly. Could fix one in the dark if I had to." Thomas grinned. "Guess that explains why you always figure out how to keep things running. Even this old bucket of bolts." Mac smirked, eyes still on the track ahead. Yeah, well, in the army, the birds were expensive. Here, just don't fall off and you'll be fine. As the train rolled deeper into the forest, the new track gleamed under the fading light, vanishing into a stretch of wilderness neither of them could remember seeing on any map. The wheels clanged over a joint in the rail, the sound snapping Thomas's attention back to Mac. The older man's eyes narrowed at the sight of the unmarked track ahead, like he was staring at a ghost. You know, Mac said after a moment, when I was just barely 20, I met this old hobo. Fellow was older than dirt. Looked like he'd been riding since Teddy Roosevelt was still president. He told me there were lines out here that ain't on any map. Built back in the early 1900s before the big rail companies swallowed everything up. Ran freight for mines and mills that don't exist anymore. Thomas glanced at the steel shining in the afternoon light. And you think this is one of them? Mac nodded slowly. Could be. He swore some of them run clean out of state. Long forgotten. No schedules, no dispatchers. Just steel and wood stretching on until you hit a place you weren't supposed to find. The forest around them grew thicker, the track curving in ways that felt deliberate, purposeful, like someone had laid it with a destination in mind that was never meant for the public. Thomas could feel the air change, the sort of stillness that made your instincts prick up. They'd been rolling steady for hours when the unmarked line split off, curving away from the main track like it was trying to hide. No markings, no mileposts, just rust-streaked rails leading deeper into the thick green of Wayne National Forest. Mac grinned like a man seeing an old friend. This is it. Off the map. Thomas leaned forward, scanning the line ahead. It felt wrong in a way that was tempting. He nodded. Let's take it. The train clattered onto the hidden branch, the air cooling under the canopy. The further they went, the more the world seemed to fall away. No road crossings, no signs of towns, just track and timber. An hour later, the train lurched, then hissed to a full stop on a narrow, weathered trestle spanning a black ravine. The sudden silence was thick. Mac checked the panel and gave a low whistle. Safety shutoff tripped. Tracks ahead are flagged as unstable. Some sensor must have caught the flex in the rails. Thomas stepped to the edge of the cab, glancing down between the gaps in the planks. The drop was dizzying, the bottom swallowed in shadow. Somewhere below, bats stirred, their squeaks and wing beats bouncing up the walls of the gorge. Then came something else. Faint, irregular sounds from the dark. Not bats, not wind. A slow, dragging scrape. A thud, then silence again. Mac was already grabbing his tools. Won't take long to reset it. Just keep your eyes on the dark, kid. Thomas kept his eyes on the dark ahead, the wind whispering through the gaps in the trestle. He almost missed it at first, a small shape padding along the rails just past the beam of the headlight. When it stepped into the glow, his breath caught. Holy shit, he muttered. It's a cat, gray and white, with a neat little tuxedo pattern. The animal walked like it owned the bridge, tail flicking lazily despite the drop on either side. Thomas leaned out the cab window, cupping his hands around his mouth. Here, kitty, come here. His voice echoed down into the black, scattering the bats again. The cat paused, one paw lifted mid-step, and turned its head toward him. Its eyes caught the light, two perfect green coins in the dark, before it calmly sat down on the rail, as if waiting for him to come to it. Mac glanced up from his tools. You kidding me? On this bridge. Thomas ignored him, leaning a little farther out, calling again. The cat just stared. For a heartbeat, the tuxedo cat sat perfectly still, eyes unblinking in the beam. Then, without warning, it bounded forward, swift, silent, and vanished from sight under the front of the engine. Mac swore under his breath and ducked instinctively, thinking it had gone for the wheels. A second later, the cat sprang up onto the side step, then into the cab like it had done it 100 times before. Before Thomas could react, it trotted right over to where Mac was crouched, wrench in hand, and started licking the back of his neck with deliberate sandpaper strokes. Mac froze, eyes narrowing. What the hell? He tried to hunch his shoulders, but the cat just climbed onto them, purring like a buzzsaw while rubbing its face against the side of his head. Thomas grinned. "Guess it likes you." "I'm trying to work here," Mac grumbled, but he didn't push it away. The cat kept licking, tail curling happily, as the creak of the bridge and the distant drip of water below filled the dark. Mac twisted the last coupling into place, then gave the starter a sharp pull. The engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life with a shudder that rattled the whole cab. The Tuxedo Cat's ears shot back, and it sprang half a foot into the air, landing on the console with wide eyes. Its tail puffed out like a bottle brush. "Easy, easy," Max said, reaching a grease-streaked hand toward it. His voice was low and steady, the same tone he might have used coaxing a stubborn engine part into cooperating. "Ain't nothing to worry about, fuzzball." The cat hesitated, then let him scratch just under its chin, purring again in seconds. Mac glanced toward Thomas. "Just need a couple more minutes to make sure she'll hold," he said, nodding toward the humming engine. "Don't want her dying halfway off this bridge." Below them, something splashed in the darkness. The cat's ears flicked toward the sound, but it stayed put, crouched near Mac's arm like it wasn't going anywhere just yet. Mac jerked his arm back from the engine with a hiss. "Son of a..." He clenched his teeth, rubbing the reddening patch of skin on his forearm. "Damn exhaust pipes hotter than hell." Thomas leaned forward, ready to toss a jab, but the movement caught something in the corner of his eye. His stomach dropped. Out ahead, faint shapes were shambling along the narrow bridge, silhouetted by the dim moonlight cutting through the trees. A dozen, maybe more, slow, steady, and headed straight for them. "Mac!" Thomas's voice was sharp now, all the humor gone. "We got company. Hurry it up, man." Mac's head snapped up, and he saw them too. He tightened a bolt with one hand while reaching for his wrench with the other, working faster now. The Tuxedo Cat's fur bristled, and it let out a low, uneasy growl, like it knew exactly what was coming. Mac gritted his teeth, his burned arm forgotten as he twisted the last bolt into place. "That's it," he muttered, slamming the access panel shut. "Hang on." The engine coughed once, twice, then roared back to life with a deep, metallic growl. The Tuxedo Cat startled, darting in a tight circle before pressing itself against Mac's leg, ears flat. Thomas threw a glance at the approaching horde, now close enough that the moonlight caught the wet sheen on their faces. "Punch it," he barked. Mac yanked the throttle forward, and the train lurched ahead, metal wheels screaming against the rails. The first zombie hit the front plate with a wet thump, spinning away into the darkness. The rest followed, vanishing under the iron weight with sickening crunches. The bridge groaned under them, the sound rising above the engine's roar. Thomas felt it swaying, just enough to make his stomach turn. Halfway across, he caught sight of a cracked support beam jutting up beside the tracks, split nearly in two. As the heavy wheels passed over, the wood snapped like brittle bone, splinters scattering into the night. For a heartbeat, the whole train seemed to sag. Then the forward momentum carried them off the worst of it, the bridge still holding, but only barely. Behind them, the structure sagged more, dry-rotted planks giving way piece by piece, until the far section began tilting toward the black void of whatever was beneath. Neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the fading moan of the undead and the low, steady rumble of steel on steel as they left the collapsing bridge behind. The moment the front cab cleared the last support beam, Thomas felt the train jerk hard, too hard. He spun around just in time to see the rear two cars sagging at an ugly angle, their couplers straining under the weight. The bridge gave a tortured groan, then a sharp crack as another rotted beam snapped. One of the dangling cars shifted lower, the metal wheels screeching against the rails as gravity pulled. "Thomas, we gotta cut him loose now," Mac yelled over the roar of the engine. Thomas didn't waste time. He grabbed the pry bar from its bracket and ran down the narrow catwalk, the Tuxedo Cat darting after him with its tail puffed. The air smelled of rust and rot, and every vibration through the steel felt like a countdown. The coupler pin was jammed, thick with rust and bent slightly from the strain. Thomas slammed the bar down on it, once, twice, his hands slipping from sweat. The bridge groaned again, the sound deeper this time, and the dangling cars lurched forward an inch. "Come on, damn you," he growled, wedging the bar under the locking arm and heaving with all his weight. The pin finally shot free with a metallic clang. The released cars slid back, slow at first, then gravity took them. They rolled down the cracked section of track, pulling free just as the last support gave way. With a deafening crash, both cars dropped into the darkness, taking a cloud of splintered wood and twisted rail with them. Thomas stumbled back toward the cab, chest heaving. Mac was already pushing the throttle again, the train creeping forward off the last few feet of unsteady rail. Behind them, the bridge was nothing but a gaping hole in the night. Thomas was halfway back to the cab, boots clanging on the narrow steel walkway, when the whole train jolted from the shifting weight. His foot slipped on a patch of slick, rust-coated metal, and suddenly there was nothing under him but cold air and the black void where the bridge used to be. Wind rushed past his ears as his legs dangled over open space. His heart slammed against his ribs, hands clawing for anything solid. Then wham! A rough grip clamped around his forearm. "Not today, damn it!" Mac's voice roared over the engine and the distant crash of debris below. Thomas felt his shoulder wrench painfully as Mac hauled him up, the man's boots skidding for traction on the graded walkway. With one final heave, Thomas was back on his feet, knees buckling as he caught his breath. Mac didn't even slow down, just shoved him toward the cab. "Move your ass before this whole thing decides it's had enough of us." They both stumbled inside, the cab doors slamming shut just as the train pushed forward into the safety of solid ground. Thomas slumped into the worn seat, hands still trembling from the near fall. He didn't say a word, just yanked his pack off the floor and dug through it, tossing aside a crumpled shirt, a half-empty can of beans, and a busted flashlight. At the very bottom, his fingers brushed something small and familiar. He pulled out a half-burnt nicotine vape, the mouthpiece scuffed from being rattled around for who knows how long. He didn't even check if it still worked, just took a long, ragged pull until the harsh vapor burned his throat. Then he reached under the seat, grabbed a warm, half-flat beer, and drained it in one go. Wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, he finally broke the silence. "Well," he muttered, leaning back against the seat, "we're still alive." Mac popped the top off the can of beans with his pocket knife, the metal lid bending back with a dull crack. He scooped a few into his hand and tossed them down in front of the cat, who immediately began eating like it hadn't seen food in days. Neither of them said much after that. The hum of the engine and the steady clack-clack of the wheels became the only rhythm in their world. The old bridge, the near fall, the zombies, they all faded into the background. For better or worse, there was only one direction left: forward. The next 2 days blurred together into a haze of cold mornings, stiff muscles, and endless steel rails cutting through hills, forests, and abandoned towns. At night, they took turns keeping the engine running and dozing off in short bursts, never trusting the quiet for too long. By the time the second day's light broke over the horizon, the landscape had shifted, pine forests growing thicker, air sharper and colder. The battered train rolled back onto a main line, the tracks stretching out toward a whole new state far from where they'd started. The sign they passed was sun-faded and barely hanging on, but it still read, "Welcome to Libby, Montana," in chipped white paint. Libby had seen better days, probably decades ago. Half the houses they passed were sagging inward, paint stripped away by years of wind and snow. Old storefronts sat boarded up, their broken glass reflecting the pale morning light. Even the streets felt abandoned, weeds cracking through the asphalt. Up ahead, the train slowed to a crawl. A rusted-out sedan sat sideways across the rails, its tires rotted to nothing, windows gone, and had popped like someone had tried to work on it years back and just gave up. Mac killed the throttle and the train groaned to a stop. "Well," he muttered, grabbing his gloves, "guess we're moving this damn thing or we're living here now." The cold bit at their faces as they hopped down, boots crunching on gravel. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called long and lonely, and then it was quiet again. Too quiet. Mac grunted as he leaned into the wheel, the rusted driver door creaking like it might snap clean off its hinges. Thomas braced both hands against the dented trunk, boots digging into the gravel. Every shove made Josh's dog tag and Shoestring's old rail spike clink together against his chest, a hollow metallic rhythm that seemed too loud for the dead silence around them. The car's frame protested, metal scraping against rails, until finally it lurched forward. A sharp squeak burst from beneath as a rat bolted out, its matted fur streaked with grease. The gray and white cat launched from the train's side rail without hesitation, landing square on the rat and wrestling it into the weeds. Mac glanced up from the wheel. Guess we got ourselves a damn Mauser now. Just past the tracks, an old convenience store sat hunched against the gray sky. The faded sign above the door barely clung to its frame, half the letters missing. The windows were clouded with grime, and one door hung crooked on its hinges. Thomas nodded toward it. Beer, smokes, and maybe something in a can. Worth a look. Mac slung his bag over his shoulder, eyes scanning the street. Let's make it quick. This place feels wrong. The cat padded after them, licking its whiskers. Thomas slid the Glock 17 from his bag, the polymer grip cold against his palm. The click of the slide check echoed faintly in the still air. Mac noticed but didn't say a word, just adjusted his coat and kept moving. The store looked like it had been dead long before the dead came walking. The paint on the walls had peeled down to bare wood in long, curling strips. The cracked glass door bore a sun-bleached open sign that hadn't been true in years. Inside, the air was stale and dry, thick with the smell of dust and old cardboard. Every aisle was a skeleton. Empty shelves, overturned displays, and wrappers that crackled under their boots. The coolers had been pried open, doors hanging limp, and the back wall was spray-painted with half-faded graffiti. Mac stepped over a broken mop handle, scanning the floor. Looks like someone's already picked it clean 10 times over. Yeah, Thomas said, eyes scanning the aisles. Still might be scraps, maybe even some cat food. The cat, tail high, padded ahead of them like it owned the place, sniffing at empty chip bags and batting at a crushed soda can. Mac crouched behind the counter, shoving aside a stack of faded lottery slips and crumbling receipts. He came up with a dusty Ziploc of loose tobacco and a half-crushed pack of zigzag papers, holding them up with a smirk. Not bad for a store that's been dead longer than we have, he muttered. Thomas, digging through the bottom shelf of an aisle, pulled free a faded road map of the region. Edges curled and soft from years of handling, and a half-torn bag of dry cat food. The corners were gnawed open, and a few black specks of rat droppings clung to the paper, but the cat wouldn't care. Guess dinner's on me, Thomas said, dropping it into his pack. They filled an old grocery basket with whatever scraps were left. 2 cloudy bottles of water, a few dented cans with the labels worn off, and a box of stale crackers that looked like they'd been sitting there since before the outbreak. Mac rolled the tobacco into a tight pouch and stuffed the papers in his coat pocket. Could have been worse. Could have been better, Thomas replied, giving the cat a quick scratch before shouldering his pack. Let's get it back to the train before something finds us first. Thomas shoved the old stack of lottery tickets into his bag, muttering old habits die hard. They left the store with their small haul stuffed into worn packs, boots crunching on gravel as the train came back into view. The cold air smelled faintly of rust and damp wood. Near the tracks, Mac slowed, his gaze fixed ahead. There, shuffling along the ballast, was 8-Ball Travis, what was left of him. The ripped, faded denim jacket hung in tatters, threads swaying in the breeze. Mac's jaw tightened. That jacket dragged him back to a night decades ago, huddled in an old grain car with Travis, breath turning to frost as the wind knifed through the boards. They'd laughed back then, half to keep warm and half to keep sane, thinking the cold would be the thing to kill them. Now, looking at Travis's lurching gait and hollow eyes, Mac knew the cold had never even been close. They trudged away from the gutted convenience store, the weight of their meager haul heavy on their backs. Plastic water bottles clinked against one another in Thomas's pack, the faint rattle echoing in the empty air. The cat padded along beside them, tail flicking lazily, carrying its stolen rat prize like a trophy. Gravel crunched underfoot, each step measured, the cold biting deep enough to make their knuckles ache. The train came into view just beyond a bend, dark steel against the faded winter sky. Its bulk sat silent on the rails, a waiting beast. That was when Max stopped dead in his tracks, his boots locking into the stones as if they'd frozen in place. His eyes narrowed at a figure moving unsteadily near the tracks, just close enough to the train's shadow to be half swallowed by it. It was him. Even from a distance, there was no mistaking the ripped, faded denim jacket. Once a proud badge of miles traveled and nights survived. Now it hung in tatters, shredded at the cuffs, threads dancing in the faint wind. It looked like it had been soaked and dried 100 times over, stiff with grime and something darker. 8-Ball Travis. The name hit Mac like a gut punch. That jacket was a ghost all by itself, dragging him back to that night years ago, in an old grain car somewhere between Cheyenne and hell itself. He and Travis had curled up in opposite corners, their bodies shaking so hard they could barely light their smokes. They'd kept each other alive with half-baked jokes and the promise that when the sun came up, they'd hop something warmer. Back then, the cold had felt like the enemy. Now, staring at the slack-jawed thing swaying in front of him, Mac knew the cold had never been close to the worst thing out here. "Tram fam." Mac's voice came low at first, like a test of whether Travis could still hear him at all. Then, with more force, he called it again, the old train hopper salute carrying a rough edge of both recognition and grief. He stepped forward, slow and steady, like a man approaching a half-wild animal. His gloved hand slid into his belt and drew the Bowie knife, the steel catching the last shreds of daylight. The blade didn't waver, but Mac's eyes. They carried the weight of someone about to bury a piece of his past. Mac closed the last few steps in silence, the crunch of gravel giving way to the creak of Travis's slow turn toward him. The thing's head tilted at an unnatural angle, its clouded eyes failing to recognize anything but the sound of movement. Mac didn't give it the chance to lunge. One swift, brutal kick caught Travis's knee from the side, the joint folding with a sickening pop. The body crumpled to the ground, hands clawing at the dirt. Mac dropped to one knee beside him, the Bowie knife poised. There was no hesitation, just a single deep thrust, steel splitting bone with a wet crunch. The body went still. Mac stayed there for a moment, the knife still buried, his gloved hand gripping the hilt tight. His breath came heavy, fogging in the cold air. When he finally pulled the blade free, it was with a sharp yank. Blood and something darker clung to the steel before he wiped it clean on the tattered denim. Without a word, Mac reached under the jacket's collar, fingers finding the thin chain. He pulled hard, snapping it free, and held the dog tags in his hand for a moment, staring at the engraved name as if reading it might make the man come back. Thomas had stopped a few steps away, his Glock resting at his side. The clink of the chain in Mac's palm was the only sound between them until Thomas straightened his back and brought his hand to his temple in a crisp, deliberate salute. The gesture was sharp, military precise, a quiet acknowledgement of a fellow serviceman. He didn't say anything, but the weight of the moment spoke for both of them. For Thomas, it wasn't just about Travis, it was about Todd, about the unit, about all the names that wouldn't be said out loud again. The two men turned away from the body without another glance. The cat, still clutching its half-shredded rat, trotted after them, oblivious to the heaviness in the air. Boots crunched over the frostbitten gravel as they made their way back to the tracks. The train loomed in the cold light, its paint faded, its steel skin groaning in the wind. Neither Thomas nor Mac spoke. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't cheapen the moment. Mac climbed up first, the dog tags clenched in one fist, his other hand gripping the rusted rail. Thomas followed, swinging himself into the cab, the weight of the Glock still heavy on his thigh. The cat hopped up behind them, tail flicking, as if it had always belonged there. Mac settled into the engineer's seat, turning the ignition with a slow, deliberate twist. The engine coughed, then roared to life, vibrations rumbling through the floor. Thomas leaned against the frame, eyes fixed on the rails ahead. The horn let out a low, mournful blast that echoed into the emptiness. No destination, no schedule, just steel and rails stretching into the unknown. They were back on the route to nowhere,